All right, good afternoon, everybody. This is Nick Dinsmoor. I'm a guest moderator for the Wireless Buffet. We're super excited for the conversation we have today. We have some amazing panelists. So let's get this thing going. Let's start off with introductions of the team. We'll start at my left. I'll start with Al Brown. If you want to introduce yourself, and then we'll go on down to our other members.
Sounds great, Nick. Thanks for being here and participating in this. I am Al Brown, President and CEO of SmartWAVE Technologies. We are a wireless-centric design build management firm working with smart cities and schools trying to overcome this issue of the digital divide.
Awesome. Well, welcome. And let's go on down to the fine gentleman from the grants office. Let's start with Patrick.
Hi, everybody. My name is Patrick Riedy. I head up the K-12 education team at Grants Office. Just a little bit of background on our Grants Office. We're a grants intelligence firm that has been around for over 20 years. And we work a lot in K-12, obviously, also state and local government and healthcare, as well as higher education. So really, bulk of our job is consulting with schools to get them the tech that they need through grant funding.
Welcome. And last but certainly not least, Richard.
Thanks. Yeah, so I'm Richard. I'm on the state and local government team at Grants Office. So I do a lot of like cybersecurity and smart cities type projects, but I also do some broadband stuff. So I will be able to talk to that a little bit with you guys.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. Obviously, you can't hit the Google search button without seeing something online about grants, stimulus, broadband, digital divide, digital equity. It is all over the place, which from my perspective, actually, and I know Al would probably agree, is a great thing. The fact that we're talking about this, things that I know, we've talked about for years and years and years, that's now become everyday language. That's progress to me. That's a huge progress. But for the people that are listening, let's try to make sure they understand what's even the difference. Like we hear stimulus, we hear infrastructure package, we hear grants. What's the difference in all these?
A lot of confusion, Nick.
I know. It's just,
I have no idea.
There's a lot of money out there, but what does it mean?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So essentially, prior to the pandemic, by and large, what you had were what we call traditional grant opportunities. And that the main difference is that the bulk of the legwork that somebody who's applying for a grant is going to need to do for a traditional opportunity is going to be on the front end. So they're going to need to have, the project idea in mind, and it's going to have to be comprehensive and include the products that they're looking for to meet, in the case of K-12 education, the student achievement demands that they might have. So usually what you're looking at for a traditional grant, a lot of lead time, a lot of prep time, getting the team together, making sure that everybody is writing the parts of the narrative that they need to write, that you're getting quotes from vendors that are going to make sense for a budget narrative, because that's going to be an important part of it. You're going to have other attachments like resumes, who's going to be, part of the team that's going to execute that grant in a K-12 space, right? If you're trying to work on after-school programming, who's going to be the head of that after-school programming? Who's the person that's going to be, with the kids in the classroom actually delivering on that comprehensive project that you're talking about? And then, there are some state, federal spending restrictions on traditional grant opportunities, that you might be aware of. Supplement, not supplant, you may have heard in the past. That's something that really that's language of that traditional grant opportunity. And then usually for traditional grants, pre-award costs are not allowed. For stimulus, that kind of threw a wrench in the whole thing.
Everything, wrench, though, right?
A good wrench, yeah, for sure. I mean, it's brought about because of an emergency, right? COVID-19. Anybody who knows anybody who works in a school, who sends their kids to school, can think back to March 13th, 2020, and it was the apocalypse for all intents and purposes, right? Kids are home. 2 weeks turns into 2 months, turns into going on 2 years now for some kids who are super high risk. So. The stimulus funding really flipped the script. A lot of that pre-award preparation, that money was sent to the schools, and a lot of that kind of reportage and verbiage and justification came or is coming on the back end. So rather than get all your ducks in a row, prepare the application, have that budget justification before you apply for that award, the stimulus grant funding is we understand this is an emergency. This is the federal government and state governments talking now. We understand this is emergency. We understand that you need this money. We're going to give you this money, and then everything's going to be on the back end. So you're going to tell us why you made the purchases you made, right? Under some fairly flexible allowances in the K-12 space. And sure, similar to state and local government. But that's, in a nutshell, that's the bulk of the difference. So, traditional grants, pre-award costs, not allowed. Stimulus grants, pre-award costs could be allowed. In ESSER for K-12 education, you could pre-award costs back to March 13th, 2020. You can reimburse some of the purchases that you made right at that start. If a school is really aggressive in identifying, like, hey, these kids need Chromebooks and we can't wait until the stimulus money comes in, and they had some money in their budget, they provided those Chromebooks to those students, then that can be reimbursed with these ESSER dollars. You don't typically see that in traditional grants. So I think a lot of the confusion stemmed from that.
So Patrick, how do you go about picking like from which grant is best for you? I mean, do some have kind of an easier lift than others as far as how much time and resources required and so forth?
So for stimulus grants or for traditional grants, you're talking about?
All of the above.
Yeah. So
I mean, it's all about getting the money, man. So we want the easy way to get the money and put it to work as fast as possible and make a difference, right?
Yeah. I mean, the stimulus grants, the lift is intentionally light, right? For K-12 space, it's really fairly wide flexibility in terms of what the allowable expenses are, anywhere from purchasing PPE to purchasing educational technology, to HVAC kind of repairs that are necessary to help curb COVID. So the lift is really minimal. Like I said, that money is emergency funding, so it went straight to the schools in this instance to help them, right? So another thing we've seen too, I should add, is that there's multiple stimulus kind of packages. I've talked a lot about ESSER. ECF is another one, kind of a parallel program to E-rate that people may be familiar with. And so what we've also seen happen is maybe being strategic about, like, okay, you look at something like ECF and they want to get hotspots and Chromebooks to students' hands. So that might cause some reconsideration of what you were trying to do with your ESSER money. If you were originally trying to do hotspots and Chromebooks with your ESSER money, all of a sudden this other program came about that is looking to intentionally fund those things. So being a little bit strategic, making sure you're, kind of staying, as up to date as possible with the many opportunities. But in terms of lightest lift, the stimulus funding is definitely going to be a lighter lift than traditional grant opportunities. Traditional grants, more of the long game sort of thing.
Okay.
Whereas,
a lot of the clients we work with, they're it's great to have the hot spots. It's great to have like an interim kind of quick fix. But for those clients that we're working with, where we're trying to create a fixed infrastructure or a need, kind of a long-term need, kind of what direction do you point those clients into?
So I'll speak briefly and then hand it over to Richard, because that'll be more so SLG space. But in terms of if it's a K-12 school, if it's a school district that really wants to address maybe the long-term need that their community that they service might have, right? So say they're a school that services a lot of rural students, right? Or they're in an area without just like, a lot of commercial options for internet service. That ESSER fund is going to be the key to that, right? There can be some long-term planning kind of utilized in that ESSER bucket. But at the same time, those funds are being pulled in a lot of different directions. So I'll pass it off to Richard, and he could talk a little bit about how state and local government can pair with some of that K-12 funding to maybe complement each other.
Sure. Yeah. So in the state and local government space, the stimulus funding that's going to be the longest lasting is the American Rescue Plan, state and local fiscal recovery funds. So those state and local governments have until the end of 2024 to spend the money. And then projects can continue until the end of 2026. So it's definitely a longer runway than the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund money. Beyond that, there's also some other broadband funding, particularly at like rural areas, like Patrick was mentioning, like the USDA's Reconnect program and Community Connect. And then there's also some economic development funding from the Economic Development Administration that's focused on like how broadband can improve the local economy. So those are some of the areas.
I mean, is there for, again, for the for the schools and communities that really need money. I mean, can you combine all these things? Can you do the stimulus
great
grants, the
question.
non-grants? Can you put it all together? Because at the end of the day, again, as Al said, it's putting the money to work to deliver something. Can you combine all these things together?
Yes, you can combine them all. You just can't double dip. So you can't say that like we're having we're using like different pots of money to pay for the same thing, because then you're just like getting money for like that doesn't work like accounting wise. If you get like $200 to pay for a $100 project and you get 100 from two different grants, then you have
I don't think
$100
we're
extra
doing, we're
dollars.
not NASA. We're not
yeah.
buying $500 toilet seats and things
Right,
like
Yeah.
that. I get it, but from a school that needs it, you can basically combine the different types of grants to build the infrastructure, build the net, build all these pieces, as long as it's, again, it's not the double dipping.
Right, yeah, and you can apply for as many grants as you can handle. So there are a lot of reporting requirements on the back end for grants. So you want to make sure that you're able to like administer the grant programs once you get the money, because it can be overwhelming for a lot of smaller local governments and schools. Patrick, I don't know if you want to talk to that.
And well, one of the things that we do when we meet with a client and they're trying to overcome this digital divide program or problem, it could be led initially by a school district, or it could be led by a city itself or a county. And what we try to do is encourage them to work together, simply because, for sustainability purposes, you're somewhat serving the same environment in the same locations, right? If you can bring connectivity to a student in a household, well, you can also serve their siblings and their parents and so forth, and make an entire community movement. So that was kind of where the question with Nick came from, right? I mean, how can we, take advantage of the funds that are available and maximize the return on connectivity for those funds that we receive, so we create some type of infrastructure that then can be sustainable. So it's not a quick fix, right? Just is taking the dollar for the marathon as opposed to the sprint, right? and doing as much as we can with it.
Yeah, and one thing to pay attention or to keep in mind is, yes, certainly like strategic partnerships are key, right? Like if you're a school administrator, you want to be in contact with your county office, with your town or city office, whomever is in charge of what those plans are, but also keeping in mind that who you service, right? So a school is going to service the students. So there are some necessities for constant communication, right? Like if you have broadband, that school is going to want to make sure what that student's accessing at the house is, having the same filters as what they have at school. So having those conversations with, who's benefiting from these services, and what portions of what buckets are going to fund or support, like whoever that entity services. So for a school, they're worried about servicing the students, right? But they could certainly work together with the county if in that same household there's, other people who are in need as well, right? So it's kind of making sure that, and in one respect, you're staying in your lane, but you're staying in conversation with those who are in their respective lanes as well, so that you could kind of get the most comprehensive, bang for your buck, so to speak, right? That everybody's getting what they need without kind of stepping on each other's toes. That's really important, right? Making sure that you have those conversations with respective offices, whomever's in kind of has their hand on the purse at the moment, right?
Got it. So as we
go ahead, Nick.
I was just going to say, I mean, there's a lot of the grants and the stimulus stuff that's out there now, from a date perspective, what's coming? Like, I mean, should people is 2022 going to be even bigger year for grants? And I guess let's make the distinction between the stimulus grants and just normal grants, right? Because obviously the infrastructure bill just passed. It's $65 billion towards broadband. That's a lot of money. Hopefully that's going to do a lot of good for a lot of communities, a lot of schools, but that stimulus. So what about just the grants? Is that going to be increasing in 2022 as well?
Can take that. Yeah. So the infrastructure bill actually includes some extra funding for new grant programs and for existing grant programs. So it's not just stimulus funding that'll be here for like 1 year. A lot of them will continue annually. Like a big chunk of the 65 billion is going to a new program called the Broadband Equity Access and Deployment Program, I believe. And that's about 45 billion, I think, of the 65 billion.
Not all 45 million. That's it.
with a B.
With a B. With a B.
With a B. Yeah. Yeah, so that's going to be, I think, a reoccurring program each year. It's for like broadband infrastructure and accessibility. I think it goes to states, and then states will decide how they want to allocate it to local governments for improving the broadband accessibility in their areas. So definitely a focus on rural areas is going to be continue into 2022. There's also more funding for a tribal broadband grant program. So Native American tribes will get a pot of money for applying to broadband grants to improve their broadband infrastructure, because a lot of them live in rural areas. And there was just recently from one of the December stimulus package, the Coronavirus Response and Relief Supplemental Appropriations Act included a Native American broadband grant that was really popular. And they got like way more requests for funding than they had funding available. So the infrastructure bill includes a lot more funding for that program. And then also digital equity, I think Elle mentioned, there's like a specific digital equity grant, and a lot of the grant programs included within the infrastructure bill have a focus on digital equity and like improving accessibility to broadband for underserved folks.
So if you think about
Richard,
I mean,
I know that like we're engaged with a client in Illinois, and when you talk about the funds being allocated to the states, the customer we're working with, they took advantage of the Connect Illinois grant. So are they rebranding these grant funds, or are there also grassroots movements within the states themselves to also address the problems?
Yeah, so it's both. I know some states repackaged some of the CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund money for broadband grants, which was interesting because that money wasn't like specifically for broadband, and it wasn't like specifically mentioned in the funding that it could be used for broadband, but it could be used for COVID response. And a lot of states realized that broadband was important for COVID response because everyone's working from home, and definitely there was a bigger like demand for being able to access the internet from a lot of residents of these states. So there's that. And then, yeah, lots of states also have their own broadband programs predating the stimulus funding. So I think Connect Illinois predates the stimulus funding. There are a few big ones that I'm not able to think of. I know, like, I'm in New York State, and New York had
Connect Nation in Texas. Is that one?
I have not actually heard of that one. But that might be
maybe it's Connected Texas. Maybe
Yeah. So Texas did some things with their actual their SEA reserve. So the state education agency had a reserve from some of the stimulus funding, and they've been fairly aggressive in terms of creating programs to address, similar to what Richard mentioned. They identified maybe the best way they could use their COVID response funds was to provide broadband access to, kind of deal with the digital divide the best way they saw fit. So they created grant opportunities from the reserve that they have. So the way ESSER worked is that, the federal government would pass it on to a state. 90% had to be re-granted to local education agencies, and then the state retained 10%. And with that 10% is where we see some of these states, creating programs specifically for broadband, for digital divide, kind of trying to close that.
So let me ask you two questions, I guess. One, are any of these programs helping? Because we use the term digital divide and digital equity pretty generically, I think, and it's good that the terms are out there, but arguably there's the piece of getting the infrastructure, which is building the networks, building solutions, which Hal obviously is super familiar with. And then there's the affordability piece, right? Like, I mean, you can build it, but like they need to be able to pay for it. So I'm wondering, are any of these grants helping support paying for it? And then the second part of the question is, what should be the schools, the communities, like with all this coming in, what should be their thoughts and their kind of their insights that they should be doing going into 2022, knowing that there are, sounds like, state level stuff and federal level stuff? Like, what should they be doing?
Yeah, so I know in the infrastructure bill, there's a broadband affordability program. It's not really a grant program. It goes directly to households so that they can afford paying for broadband themselves rather than to like broadband providers. Yeah, there's also there's a specific digital equity grant in the new infrastructure bill that I think has $2 billion allocated to it. So that would be focused on improving accessibility for underserved residents and underserved. They increase the number of people that are considered underserved in the infrastructure bill. So it's people who who don't have access to 100 megabits per second down, 20 megabits per second up. So I know previously it was often 25, 25.3. So now more folks are considered underserved now with the infrastructure bill. So more communities would be eligible for a lot of these programs. And Patrick, I don't know if there's anything with K-12 that you want to mention.
Yeah, if you don't mind just repeating the second part of that question, Nick. I think I got lost.
I mean, as we're, you've mentioned there's obviously the federal stuff, the state stuff, and Al mentioned, some of the state level things that are outside of that. If I'm a community and, they're listening to us, like, what's the advice? What advice should they be going and saying, hey, go to I'm going to look at state first, or I'm going to look at federal first? Like, what should they be doing to be able to take most advantage of this and get the ball rolling?
Yeah, I mean, first and foremost, they need to look at their need, right? Because the need's going to vary district by district, right? So really that's going to be the driving force of where they're going to look, right? If their district requires them to reach out to rural areas, or they serve students who are living on tribal lands, then, as Richard mentioned, there's specific programs for that they might be more akin to kind of addressing or kind of reaching out to. If they're a district that has a lot of students experiencing homelessness, right, they might want to pay attention to some of the specific programs that exist for those students. So in the American Rescue Plan, there's a separate ESSER bucket that is specifically for students experiencing homelessness. So really their need is what drives where they should look. The ESSER funding will be there for the districts, right? That's a pass-through opportunity. So it's comes from the federal government, but is administered by the state. So really, one way or another, that's, for all intents and purposes, a federal fund, right? But if they live in a state like Texas or California, provided some additional reserve monies that I mentioned earlier for learning loss mitigation, which can certainly, broadband initiatives can certainly be a part of that, because you could have all the best planned learning loss mitigation, but if you can't get that information delivered to students, or they can't easily access it, then that's a big problem. So really, it's the needs for the district. It's who they serve. It's what they've identified as their short-term needs, and then also their long-term needs. So what we've seen in K-12 is, a lot of what Al mentioned, a little bit further back, of just the short-term kind of fix of a hotspot or a Chromebook. And then now should be probably the phases of thinking about the long-term, how do you sustain these initiatives, right? You have some runway for the ARP ESSER funds. That's going to be until September 30th, 2024. So that gives you some time to plan, right? And to at least look ahead to the future for the next 3 years. And then after that, we'll see where the political climate, where everything takes us, right? That's
the big question. So
yeah.
after, I mean, that's great to go to 2024, but what happens then? I mean, and one of the points that Nick brought up too is that I hear a lot about the focus on rural markets because there's no connectivity, or underserved or unserved communities, but there is this big issue that no one really seems to address, and it is the affordability issue. I mean, we have clients where we deployed based on grant funds in Oakland, right? And I can be in the neighborhood and I can get connectivity, but it's a whole community that can't afford it, right?
Right.
So how How do you see that being addressed with some of these grants?
Yeah, so in addition to some of the programs I've already talked about, the Department of Housing and Urban Development has some grants for like lower income folks. So there's the Community Development Block Grant Program that can provide or like help local governments provide broadband to, I think it's low to moderate income people is the restriction on it. So that's definitely targeted more toward lower income people who might have trouble with accessibility to broadband. There are a few other programs from HUD. There's the Choice Neighborhoods Grant Program. So that's sort of a large comprehensive program for improving the amenities in a neighborhood, in a lower income neighborhood. I think the language they use in the grant is like a distressed area. That will also fund like broadband accessibility for lower income people. So those are two of the main ones. Also, the funding from the Economic Development Administration, particularly the Public Works and Economic Adjustment Assistance Program. Part of it will include both like Public Works, so building out the broadband, but also the Economic Adjustment Assistance piece includes job creation and economic development in an area. So definitely like improving the economic prospects for like a given community is an important part of that program.
And I know you can appreciate this because obviously you guys work at the grants office, but there's a lot, right? Like, I mean, the number of acronyms and titles of grants that we talked about is almost like I need Newton's Telecom Dictionary to go, figure out what those are. But if I'm like, we're in the business, right? Like we work in technology, you guys work in grants, like so. I would say we have an edge up on understanding some of this stuff. But again, so let's go back to the people we're trying to do this for, right? The communities, the schools. Talk to me a little bit about like how do manufacturers, how do partners, like how do people work together to help? I mean, dummy down is not the right way to say it, but like, I mean, how do you explain some of this stuff? Because it's complicated. And if I'm doing a day job and I'm trying to figure out 10 different grants, like that's not simple. Like, so what are the mechanisms in place between partners, manufacturers, people like you that help the people we're actually trying to serve?
Yeah, give me the easy button to make it rain.
So, I mean, with schools specifically, what vendors can do, what providers can do is really, help with some of that lifting that the school, they're worried about staffing. They're worried about, isolating kids who've tested positive. They're worried about, kids, stealing stuff from the bathroom. You know what I mean? Their direction in addition to like student, test scores and what their goals are, as a district of what they want to kind of achieve or show as kind of student attainment. So what a vendor or what a provider can do is really assist with assessments that can provide, quantifiable data to kind of say like, hey, we definitely need this, right? Kind of making them those assessments and everything accessible, reducing cost barriers associated with it is possible, measuring and assessing those needs. And you get, as a vendor or a provider, you get to actually hear what the school actually needs. So that's a big important part of it, is like listening to a school about what they actually need and maybe having those conversations as opposed to kind of imposing needs on a school, listening, hearing what they need, getting a sense of what can be developed or what can be quoted in products and solutions that best fit that school, as opposed to kind of thinking that it's a one size fit all approach. Because one thing I've learned over the course of consulting with schools is that each school is different, right? Like each school has their own unique needs. They have, there's some schools that have had the same kind of stability and leadership for decades. And then there are some who are people who've been thrust into this position at, the most chaotic time. So what a vendor or what a provider can do is kind of reach out, have those conversations, provide, quantifiable data that says like, okay, this is your need. This is what we can do to help address that need. And maybe, remove some of that kind of, that crosstalk and kind of get the actual piece of paper in front of them that says like, hey, all right, you said you needed this. This is what we can provide, and this is how it'll help you. So that's from a K-12 perspective of what like a vendor can do, or what a provider can do for that community. Richard, I don't know if you have anything else to add.
Yeah, one thing I just wanted to stress is that the most successful tech companies that we work with on like grant projects see themselves as partners on the project with the customer that they're selling their solutions to. So rather than like just trying to make a quick buck, like definitely
Sure.
following through on the project and like working with the customer as much as they can is really important.
Well, it does take a village to make these initiatives happen. That's for sure.
Yeah.
I know we've worked with you guys on a few opportunities, and I mean, just knowing what funding is there is really amazing. I'm curious, like, what's the largest grant fund amount that you found available for a particular customer?
Oh, so like our largest win, like our largest success story.
Just curious, you know.
Yeah, in the state and local government space, it's usually from Department of Transportation grants. So not really like necessarily broadband focused. I know like the
Okay.
Advanced Transportation Congestion Management and Deployment Program is a big one. And then like there's some, I don't know if you guys care about transportation grants, but those are typically the biggest ones. And then stimulus funding also with CARES Act Coronavirus Relief Fund and American Rescue Plan. State and local fiscal recovery funds can have some big awards, especially to states.
Yeah, and in K-12 schools, I mean, ARP ESSER 3, so the most recent ESSER bucket is I think north of $122 billion that was passed from the federal government onto state education agencies.
Wow.
So some of the larger cities like Chicago, you know, Houston, Dallas, New York, their awards for ESSER 3 can, you know, be in the hundreds of millions. So obviously they serve an immense amount of students, and you know their needs are going to be different depending on where within that city, you know, those schools exist. In terms of traditional opportunities, there are some, you know, some grants that will award, for instance, 4 million over 4 or 5 years. EIR early phase is one that comes to mind. That is trying to look for innovative methods for student achievement and attainment in anything from STEM to general field-initiated innovations to social emotional learning. And obviously that involves like a comprehensive project and a team in place at the school to help implement some of that. But if that project involves needing to, you know, for STEM education, if vital components, say a makerspace, right? So some of the awards for that, you know, some of that money for the budget, not only for staff, not only for programming, but also for maybe the tech needs that the school might have to implement some of that. So there are definitely opportunities out there. The stimulus funding is, you know, it's unprecedented, the amount of money that has been passed through to schools. But some of the traditional grant opportunities definitely, you know, we see opportunities in the hundreds of thousands to the millions, depending on what the opportunity itself is.
Yeah, Patrick,
I
you just
guess that-
reminded me. Oh, go ahead.
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I don't think I ever said like the amount that's in the American Rescue Plan, state and local fiscal recovery funds. It's 350 billion, so it's a lot of money.
Wow.
And broadband infrastructure is an explicitly eligible expense, so that's probably like the biggest broadband funding source for state and local governments at the moment.
So the takeaway is for all of these schools and communities is listen, partner, plan, spend, and implement. Right. It's like,
Yeah.
and, you know, making sure they've got the right people and in place to, you know, I think, Patrick, you made a great point that, you know, these schools and communities, they're different. And, you know, even if it's not rural, like, I mean, it's inside urban areas, like they're all different. They all require different things and they need help. Right. So let's, I know we've talked about lots of complicated things, great insight, but let's maybe close this out with a little bit of fun. How has broadband changed Thanksgiving, right? We're recording this during a holiday week. We're coming up to Thanksgiving, coming up into the holidays. And if you think about, I'm an older guy, so I can think back at Thanksgivings that there was no broadband. I had dial-up, or even before that, actually. How has broadband changed Thanksgiving, do you guys think?
I thought about this question a little bit beforehand, and the answer is not broadband specific, it's more internet specific, but I think this was about 10 years ago. The internet taught a lot of people that they were cooking turkey wrong, because like everyone complains about how turkey is dry, and it turns out that's because everyone was cooking it wrong. So like the easiest way to cook turkey correctly is if you brine it the night beforehand and then it gets nice and moist. You can also deep fry it, or you can slow cook it. So there are some other options, but if your turkey is dry, you're cooking it wrong.
Yeah, I would say for myself, we're a remote office, so Grant's office is a remote company. So the way broadband has changed my Thanksgiving is I turn that computer off, and and it's a nice change of pace from sitting in front of screens all day, right? So broadband has changed everything. Maybe instead of Thanksgiving, right? It's allowed me to work from home. And in terms of my family, you know, traveling is going to exist more so this year. Last year, obviously, connecting with my family, using Zoom, using WebEx, things like that was needed much more last year than this year. I will see them, but yeah, for me, it's closing the computer, getting up from the computer, and kind of actually spending time face to face with people, which is a nice change of pace.
It's good advice, Patrick. For me, I live in a household with 3 girls, so it's all about the online shopping, right? And for the specials coming up. But no, all kidding aside, it is a great way to stay in touch with those that you can't go out and meet in person, right? So especially in the time that we're living in right now. But this has been a lot of fun, Nick. Appreciate you leading this again, and the grants office team. We really enjoy working with you guys. I mean, you guys are on point, right? Helping solve a problem, for these communities that we work with every day, and getting the funding allocated so we can actually make a difference, right? And that's what we can all be thankful for, is when we make an impact in the community. So
Awesome.
The wireless buffet, this is a great event. So
thanks everybody for attending. If you want to learn more information about the grants office, it's grantsoffice.com. If you want to learn more about SmartWAVE, it is smartwave.us. And I would be remiss if I didn't mention our sponsor for this episode, CommScope Ruckus. So if you want to learn more about them, commscope.com. Thank you all for our panelists. Have a wonderful holiday. And let's keep continuing to grow and support broadband in these communities that need it so much. Thank you so much, and have a great holiday.